Most people think of a surname as something ordinary, a label, a family tag, a line on a passport, something inherited, repeated, and rarely questioned. But every now and then, a surname is more than that. Sometimes it is a surviving fragment of a much older story, a clue that outlived kingdoms, invasions, language shifts, religious upheavals, border changes, and even the disappearance of entire peoples from the historical spotlight. And that is where this gets fascinating, because buried inside some of the most familiar names in Britain may be echoes of one of the oldest population stories in Europe. Not proof, not certainty, but echoes, clues, traces. And once you see them, it becomes very difficult to look at a surname the same way again. But before we uncover which surnames may carry these remarkable echoes of Britain's distant past, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating deeply researched history documentaries, and if uncovering the hidden stories behind ordinary names fascinates you, you're in exactly the right place. Now, let's go back to the beginning of Britain's story. Because Britain did not begin with castles, crowns, or even the English language. Long before Norman lords redrew power, before Anglo-Saxon kingdoms spread across much of the land, before Viking raids terrified the coasts, before Rome laid roads and walls across the island, Britain was home to older communities whose descendants were pushed, absorbed, renamed, and reshaped by wave after wave of change. Some vanished from the political record, some lost their languages, some survived in isolated regions where geography, culture, and memory gave them a little more protection than the rest. And if there is one great misconception that needs to be broken before we go any further, it is this. Ancient ancestry does not usually survive in a neat, dramatic, cinematic way. It survives quietly, indirectly, sometimes almost invisibly, sometimes in a place name, sometimes in a dialect, sometimes in genetic patterns, and sometimes, just sometimes, in a surname that stayed rooted in the right region long enough to preserve a connection to very old British continuity. That is the real tension in this story, because the names on this list do not prove that someone is descended from a single first people of Britain. Human ancestry does not work that way. It is mixed, layered, and full of overlap. A surname cannot act like a time machine. Most hereditary surnames in Britain became fixed far later than the prehistoric and early tribal worlds people often imagine when they hear the phrase oldest ancestry. So if you are expecting a list of magical names that can certify ancient bloodlines, this is not that video. And honestly, that is what makes the truth more interesting. What we are looking at here are surnames that may be associated with regions, lineages, linguistic systems, and populations that preserved older British ancestry more strongly than many others. That means the surname is not the answer. It is the doorway. And the plot twist is that some of the names most likely to suggest old continuity are not the exotic ones people expect. They are often ordinary names, common names, names people have stopped noticing, names so familiar that nobody suspects they may be standing on top of centuries of survival. By the end of this, you may discover that the most ancient thing about a surname is not how old it sounds. It is where it stayed, who kept it, and what kind of world survived underneath it. The first names on this list come from one of the regions that appears again and again whenever historians, linguists, and population researchers discuss long-term continuity in Britain: Wales. Alongside Cornwall and parts of the Scottish Highlands, Wales preserves some of the strongest surviving links to Britain's older Brittonic past. And that alone already tells you something important. When later political and linguistic change transformed much of Britain, Wales remained one of the strongest refugees of Brittonic culture, language, and identity. That does not mean Wales was frozen in time. It was not. But it does mean that Welsh history preserves unusually deep links to earlier British populations. And many Welsh surnames sit inside that continuity. The first surname is Jones. On the surface, Jones seems almost too common to belong in a video like this. It feels modern, flat, familiar. It is one of those names people barely notice because it is everywhere. And yet, that is exactly why it belongs here. Although Jones is now one of the most common surnames throughout Britain, its historical heartland remains Wales, where it became extraordinarily widespread. The surname itself comes from a patronymic tradition built around the personal name John, so no, the word Jones is not some prehistoric linguistic fossil, but its significance lies elsewhere. Its deep concentration in Welsh communities points toward family histories embedded in one of Britain's oldest surviving cultural landscapes. In other words, What matters is not that Jones is ancient in form. What matters is that many Jones families emerged from a region whose population continuity may reach much further back than the surname itself. That is one of the central ideas of this entire video. Sometimes a very ordinary-looking surname sits on top of a very old historical foundation. Then there is Evans, another name that at first glance can seem unremarkable, but under closer inspection becomes far more revealing. Derived from the Welsh form Ifan, related to John, Evans followed a similar patronymic pathway, becoming one of the major surnames of Wales. But once again, the age of the surname itself is not the main point. The deeper point is that names like Evans became fixed within communities whose roots in Western Britain may preserve continuity from earlier Brittonic-speaking populations. This is where weaker ancestry storytelling usually goes wrong. It chases dramatic origin myths while ignoring historical geography. But geography is everything. A surname embedded for centuries in a region that resisted complete cultural replacement can tell us more than a name with an impressive sounding literal meaning, but no stable regional continuity behind it. Evans matters because it is part of a larger Welsh pattern, and the pattern is the real story. That pattern becomes even clearer with Price. Price comes from the Welsh patronymic ap Rhys, meaning son of Rhys. Over time, the sounds fused until the older phrase became the fixed surname we recognize today. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because surnames like Price do more than point to Wales in general. They preserve traces of an older naming system. The ap element was a native marker of descent, and when that structure became fossilized inside later surnames, it left evidence of cultural continuity that lasted through major political transformations. So if you carry the name Price somewhere in your family tree, what is interesting is not only the person named Rhys far back in the line, it is the fact that your surname may preserve the residue of a Welsh social world, old enough to keep its own naming logic alive even while Britain around it changed. That is no small thing. The same is true of Pritchard from A.P. Richard, though this one introduces an especially useful twist. Richard is not an ancient Brittonic personal name. It entered Britain later. Yet Pritchard still belongs on this list because what matters is not just the root name, it is the Welsh patronymic framework that transformed and preserved it. This is an important correction to the way people often talk about ancestry. A surname does not need a prehistoric root word to be connected to old ancestry. It needs to have become established in a population with deep local continuity. Pritchard shows how even later personal names can become woven into older regional identities. That is precisely why serious ancestry work is more subtle than internet myth-making. The surname surface can be younger than the population underneath it. The same story continues with Bowen, usually linked to A.B. Owain, meaning son of Owain. Again, we see the survival of Welsh patronymic structure in compressed surname form. Again, we see a name that points beyond itself toward a region where older Brittonic continuity remained stronger than in many other parts of Britain. By now, a pattern has emerged, but this is not repetition for its own sake. It is accumulation. Each name adds weight to the same conclusion. The strongest surname clues to Britain's oldest ancestry are often not direct windows into prehistory. They are markers of populations that held on longer. Bowen is part of that map. And maps matter because the ancestry story of Britain is partly the story of where older identities survived, where they retreated, and where they were overlaid by later language and power. That brings us to Lloyd, one of the most distinctively Welsh surnames on this list. Derived from the Welsh word Lloyd, often interpreted as grey, Lloyd likely began as a descriptive nickname before becoming hereditary. And once more, the crucial point is context. Lloyd is a surname rooted in Welsh language and social history. It comes to us not as random vocabulary, but as part of a living linguistic inheritance from a region tied deeply to Britain's older Brittonic past. When a surname carries native language roots rather than imported elite naming fashions, it can act as a faint but meaningful signal of local continuity. Not certainty, not purity, continuity. That is the word that matters. Now here is where the story widens. Because if ancient continuity were only a Welsh story, the picture would be too simple. Britain's oldest ancestry is not confined to one region or one people. It survives in different ways across the islands. So the next surnames take us beyond Wales and into other strongholds of older cultural layers. Consider Cornish. Unlike the surnames we have just explored, Cornish is explicitly regional. It points toward Cornwall, one of the most historically distinctive places in Britain, and one of the last areas where a Brittonic Celtic language survived on the southwestern edge of the island. Cornwall matters enormously in any discussion of older British ancestry because it preserved cultural features that had disappeared elsewhere. The Cornish language was closely related to Welsh and Breton. The peninsula's relative isolation helped older traditions last longer. And while no surname can prove descent from some untouched ancient Cornish line, a name like Cornish is anchored to one of the clearest surviving zones of pre-English British continuity. That gives it unusual weight. When a surname ties not just to a family, but to a cultural refuge, it becomes more than a label. It becomes a map point in the story of survival. A similar case can be made for Pascoe, a surname strongly associated with Cornwall and linked to the Cornish form of a personal name related to Easter. At first, that may sound less ancient than what came before. But again, the key is not the literal word alone. Pascoe endured in a region where older Brittonic population patterns persisted beneath later social and linguistic change. Cornwall, like Wales, offers one of the clearest examples of how local continuity can matter more than surface etymology. A surname such as Pascoe may not sound like a relic from the Iron Age, but if it remained deeply rooted in Cornish communities, it may still point toward lineages shaped by one of Britain's oldest enduring regional identities. And that is what makes names like this so deceptive. They seem ordinary until you place them against the right historical background. Then suddenly they become much more compelling. The same regional logic helps explain Trevithick. This surname is unmistakably Cornish in flavor, built from the tre element common in Cornish place names, meaning a settlement, homestead, or farmstead. Surnames derived from old regional place name structures can be especially revealing because they preserve local language inside the name itself. Trevithick is not just associated with Cornwall, it sounds like Cornwall. It carries the signature of a place where the local naming landscape retained older Brittonic elements long after much of Britain had moved decisively into English dominance. That is powerful. Not because Trevithick is a magic key to prehistory, but because it preserves a linguistic environment where older Britain remained audible. And when older Britain remains audible, older ancestry often remains part of the story too. Before we continue north, I'm curious. Has your own surname, or one from your family tree, appeared on this list so far? If it has, let us know in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers' family histories connect across Britain and beyond, and your story might help someone else uncover a piece of their own. Now, the journey becomes even more interesting, because ancient continuity wasn't preserved only in Wales and Cornwall. From Cornwall, we move north and west into another region where older ancestry survives in especially visible ways. Scotland, particularly the Highlands and Islands. Now, this is where many viewers expect dramatic ancient lineage language, and this is exactly where caution matters most. Scottish surnames can be strongly associated with old regional populations, but Scotland too is a layered story. Picts, Gaels, Norse settlers, Britons, Anglo-Norman influence, and much more all left their mark. So once again, the point is not that one surname equals one ancient people. The point is that some surnames remained embedded in areas where very old ancestry patterns were preserved more strongly than elsewhere. Take MacLeod. The Mac structure immediately signals the Gaelic patronymic tradition, meaning son of. MacLeod is especially associated with the Hebrides and the Highlands, areas where Gaelic culture remained dominant for centuries, and where geographic isolation helped preserve older population structures. Interestingly, the name Lloyd itself is widely believed to have Norse roots, making MacLeod an excellent example of the Norse Gaelic world that developed in Scotland's western seaboard. Rather than weakening its connection to ancient ancestry, that mixture makes the story even richer. Britain's past was never shaped by isolated peoples living in neat compartments. It was shaped by communities that met, traded, fought, intermarried, and gradually became something new. A name like MacLeod reflects exactly that kind of long historical continuity. Then there's MacDonald, one of the most famous surnames in Scottish history. Because it is so famous, it is also easy to romanticize, and that can be dangerous. But even stripped of legend, MacDonald remains enormously significant. It is tied to Gaelic-speaking Highland and Island communities whose history preserved deep layers of ancestry older than the centralized British state, older than many lowland naming traditions, and in some places older than major linguistic shifts elsewhere in the islands. The clan system naturally attracts mythology, but beneath the legends lies a more grounded reality. Surnames like MacDonald often reflect centuries of continuity within communities whose population history remained remarkably stable despite enormous political change. That alone makes them important to understanding Britain's deeper past. Now, for one of the most quietly interesting names on this list, Campbell. At first, Campbell may not strike people as a candidate for Britain's oldest ancestry. It sounds distinguished, historical, perhaps even aristocratic, but not necessarily ancient. Yet Campbell is deeply rooted in Gaelic Scotland, and like several names here, its importance comes not from a claim of prehistoric origin, but from long-standing regional continuity. The Highlands preserved cultural traditions, kinship structures, and local identities that differed markedly from much of southern Britain. A surname firmly anchored in that world may point toward ancestral populations whose continuity stretches back far beyond the medieval period when hereditary surnames themselves became established. Campbell reminds us that the oldest stories are not always attached to the rarest names. Sometimes they hide behind names so familiar that we forget to ask where they truly began. The final name on this list may be the one that surprises people most, Morgan. Today, Morgan is widespread and used both as a surname and a given name, but its roots are unmistakably Welsh, and in some family lines it can point back toward exactly the kind of Brittonic continuity this documentary has been tracing from the beginning. Morgan matters because it bridges two worlds. It is instantly recognizable across the English-speaking world, yet its deeper historical identity remains firmly tied to the Welsh cultural sphere. This is important because it shows how easily an old regional signal can be disguised by later popularity. A name does not stop carrying history simply because it became common. In fact, widespread names are often the hardest to see clearly because familiarity blinds us to their depth. And now we arrive at the real reveal, the part of the story that changes the meaning of everything that came before. The biggest mistake people make with surname ancestry is assuming that the age of the surname and the age of the ancestry are the same thing. They are not. In fact, they are often dramatically different. Most surnames in Britain, even those tied to regions with exceptionally deep historical continuity, became fixed during the medieval period. But the populations carrying them often preserve ancestry from much earlier periods. That means the surname is not an ancient artifact in the way a Bronze Age sword is ancient. It is more like a medieval label attached to a much older human story. And once you understand that, the entire mystery shifts. You stop asking, is this surname prehistoric? And start asking, what kind of population history does this surname sit within? That is the question that transforms this from internet myth-making into genuine historical curiosity. Because if your surname is Jones, Evans, Price, Pritchard, Bowen, Lloyd, Cornish, Pascoe, Trevithick, MacLeod, MacDonald, Campbell, or Morgan, the interesting thing is not that you have solved your ancestry in one move. You certainly have not. What your surname may do is place one branch of your family history closer to regions where Britain's older population continuity remained especially strong or visible. That possibility is worth exploring, but it is never the final answer. A surname is one clue among many, and the strongest family histories are always built by bringing together multiple pieces of evidence. But here comes another twist, and it may be the most important one of all. If your surname is not on this list, that does not mean you lack ancient British ancestry, not even close. Many people with thoroughly English surnames, Norman-derived surnames, occupational surnames, place name surnames, or later immigrant surnames may still carry deep ancestry from Britain's oldest populations somewhere in their family tree. Why? Because surnames are narrow. Ancestry is wide. A surname follows one line. Your actual ancestry expands outward across hundreds and then thousands of ancestral lines the farther back you go. So a single surname can never capture your whole story. At best, it shines a light on one thread. A potentially fascinating thread, yes, but still only one among countless others. And that is what makes this subject so compelling. The truth is not smaller than the myth. It is larger, more tangled, more human. Britain's ancestry was shaped by prehistoric hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farming communities, Bell Beaker migrations, Iron Age societies, Romans, post-Roman Britons, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Gaels, Picts, Normans, and countless local mixtures that never fit neatly into simple historical categories. No family escaped that complexity. The names on this list are not special because they prove a fantasy of purity. They are special because they remind us how survival really works quietly and indirectly. Through language, through geography, through continuity, through communities that held on while history changed around them. So if you recognized your surname here or spotted one from your own family tree, the next step is not to declare victory. It is to investigate, discover where your grandparents came from, follow earlier census records, explore parish registers, study the local history of the places your ancestors called home, not just surname dictionaries. Pay attention to whether your family remained rooted in Wales, Cornwall, the Highlands, or another region with strong historical continuity. And if you have taken a DNA test, use it carefully. DNA can be an incredibly useful tool, but it does not map neatly onto medieval surnames or ancient tribes. The most reliable ancestry stories emerge when historical records, geography, linguistics, archaeology, and genetics all support one another, rather than relying on a single exciting clue. And maybe that is the most satisfying ending this subject could have, because it leaves us with a deeper kind of wonder. The most powerful family histories are rarely the ones that let us claim descent from one pure ancient people. They are the ones that reveal how countless generations, cultures, migrations, and communities came together to make us who we are today. A surname can be the first whisper of that story, a clue, a surviving echo from a landscape of forgotten kingdoms and living descendants. Never the whole truth, but often enough to inspire the search for it. So, did your surname make today's list? Or have you uncovered another family name that points to Britain's distant past? Share it in the comments below, because some of the most fascinating discoveries come from hearing one another's family stories. You never know when your experience might help someone else solve a mystery in their own family tree. If you enjoyed this journey into Britain's hidden past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more deeply researched history documentaries, and share it with someone who has always wondered where their family really came from. Every week, we uncover remarkable stories hidden in ordinary names, forgotten places, and overlooked moments of history, and we'd love to have you with us on that journey. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring your history, and remember that sometimes the most ordinary surname can conceal an extraordinary story stretching back across thousands of years. The greatest discoveries are often waiting in places we've looked at our entire lives without ever truly seeing them. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all.